All right. People can join as they come, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with our introduction. First, thank you all for joining us for this panel discussion. My name is John Cimino. I'm an attorney with dLCV. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a middle-aged man in a blue shirt and tan blazer. I have the dLCV Summit background on my screen. I want to thank you all for joining the session today on the intersection of disability rights and transgender rights, specifically the legal protections for transgender people diagnosed with gender dysphoria. This topic is especially important and timely today as transgender rights, and particularly the rights of transgender youth, are in attack in state houses across the country. I'll be moderating this session, and our panelists today will include Jennifer Levi, Kevin Barry, and Ezra Young. I'm going to provide a very truncated introduction to each of our panelists so you know a little bit about them. Their full bios would take the session to cover, though. Jennifer Levi is the Senior Director of Transgender and Queer Rights at GLAAD, the GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. And she's a nationally recognized expert on transgender legal issues. Along with many other professional accolades, she led the legal fight against then-President Trump's transgender military ban and has been a leader in working on harm reduction for incarcerated transgender people. Jennifer's also a law professor at Western New England University, co-editor of Transgender Family Law, and serves on the legal committee of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Ezra Young is a nationally recognized scholar and civil rights attorney. His litigation centers on trans rights and focuses on the rights of recognition, employment protection, healthcare, and insurance coverage issues. He's previously taught courses on constitutional law, critical race theory, and transgender people in the law at Cornell. Scholarly work focuses on critical trans theory and innovative equitable remedies. And Kevin Barry is professor of law at Quinnipiac University School of Law, where he teaches courses in administrative law and disability law. His legal and scholarly work focuses on civil and human rights issues, including transgender rights, disability rights, and death penalty abolition. He's filed amicus briefs on behalf of national and state transgender rights organizations and consulted on numerous cases of national significance involving the intersection of disability rights and transgender rights. Before our panelists get started, there's a couple of housekeeping items that I need to address. I'm going to ask speakers to please remember that we are using live captioning and interpreting services. So when you first introduce yourself today, whether it be as a speaker or later on as a panelist, please include a physical description of yourself and your preferred pronouns, such as I'm an African-American woman with curly black hair and glasses. I'm wearing a red blouse and have the dLCV Summit blue background. My preferred pronouns are she, her. This will help provide context to attendees who may be blind or vision impaired. It will also help our interpreters and captioners locate who is speaking on the screen. Please stay muted at all times unless you are the speaker. Hold all questions until the end. We do have a chat box that I'll be monitoring. You can use the chat box only for questions unless otherwise directed by session speakers. At the end of the session, I'll select questions that have been posed in the chat box. If I call on you to ask your question, you can take yourself off mute, ask your question, or you may simply type your question in the question box. With those logistics out of the way, Jennifer Levi will now start our panel discussion by addressing some of the legal landscape today involving transgender issues.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for that introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I also want to thank our captioner and everyone associated with coordinating the summit. It's a real privilege and honor to get to speak on this panel alongside John and Kevin and Ezra, whose work I have so much regard for. I am a white, transgender identifying person, masculine appearing. I have glasses, white hair. I'm wearing a gray hooded long sleeve t-shirt, and I respond to any pronouns. sometimes depending on the context in which they're used. So I am also, as John said, a lawyer at an organization called 𝐲𝐢𝐬𝐀𝐀 Legal Advocates and Defenders, and have been advocating for bringing disability claims on behalf of transgender people for 25 plus years. And so having a broader engaged discussion about doing that is really inspirational to me, and have really appreciated the chance to talk to John and the Disability Law Center of Virginia about trying to do more outreach across the disability advocacy community to really expand people's understanding and awareness of the ways to bring claims on behalf of transgender people, and to really, expand support and advocacy for the community. I will say that I was inspired to do this work when I really early on in my legal career saw how stigmatized the medical condition associated with being transgender is. And we're going to be talking, I know Ezra is going to be talking more specifically about what it means to be transgender and the connection between gender dysphoria, which is the clinically significant distress that a transgender person experiences who can't live consistent with their gender identity. So we'll be talking about that experience of gender dysphoria. And there is a well-established treatment for that medical condition. And with treatment, transgender people thrive, and without treatment, transgender people suffer. So early in my career, in particular, because I had the great opportunity to work with a colleague, Ben Klein, who has done a tremendous amount of disability advocacy for people with HIV/AIDS, and actually argued the first case that the Supreme Court heard under the Americans with Disabilities Act that established that the ADA prohibits discrimination against people living with HIV, whether or not they show any visible symptoms or have an AIDS diagnosis. And in discussions with Ben, we both really shared an understanding about why it's so important to ensure the broad scope of disability protections, especially for people with highly stigmatized medical conditions. And that's really what is happening for many transgender people, which is to say that there is so much stigma associated with the medical condition, and there's so much lack of understanding and so much misunderstanding about honestly the ease with which transgender people can seamlessly be incorporated into so many different contexts, including employment, including public accommodations, including in institutionalized settings. But because of the bias, the misunderstanding, and the stigma, we see transgender people really suffering and harmed across a range of different contexts. And when I started writing and speaking about ensuring that transgender people get the benefit of disability non-discrimination laws, I was unsurprised to see within the transgender community a broad lack of understanding about the purpose of disability non-discrimination laws, and stigma associated with disability more broadly. So I really appreciate the chance to have these conversations across different communities. So early on in my career, I worked on a case involving a student in school in Massachusetts who was denied the opportunity. This was a transgender girl in middle school who was sent home regularly because of her presenting as female in a school environment, and the principal not understanding who she was. And she was sent home regularly. We filed a disability claim on her behalf. Somebody asked, I just want to mention in the chat, whether that was Becoming Nicole. And this was actually years before. my representation of Nicole Maines, who's spoken very publicly about that experience in Maine. This was actually a case in Massachusetts, and worked on a number of other cases. Most recently, I've had the opportunity to collaborate and really engage with Disability Law Center of Virginia, particularly around my representation of 𝐲𝐚𝐬 Williams, an incarcerated transgender woman who was wrongly denied medical care and also wrongly placed in a men's correctional facility. But one of the things I've found is that being able to pursue a disability claim on behalf of a transgender person is also a way to educate the court about the experience of what it means to be transgender and about the importance of ensuring both access to medical care and providing reasonable accommodations for transgender people across a range of different contexts. So that's the reasons why I'm so excited to have this discussion today. And as we head into talking about some of the details, Kevin Barry's gonna talk about some of the barriers, some of the obstacles, some of the legal framings. I wanted to give folks a broad national context in terms of what we were seeing around very significant backlash that transgender people are facing. And so thank you for putting up this map, which is a map of the United States and includes color coding that reflects the multitude of laws that have been largely passed within the last 2 years that either roll back protections for transgender people or limit transgender people's access to healthcare or inclusion in schools, or actually ability to access facilities even in a broader context. And what you can see here is that the states that have color coding have most of them multiple laws that target transgender people. There's green stripes over the state of Georgia, which is of these states the only one that actually has a single law that negatively impacts transgender people in a particular way. Yeah, and thank you for someone in the chat to say I can add Virginia. Yeah, I think that this map is you're right, already out of date. But the reason I'm putting it up is that I want to kind of give you a broad context for the category, the types of laws that have now been passed to target transgender people. There are 23 states at the moment that have bans on the provision of medical care for transgender adolescents, and that happened incredibly rapidly. And we have even seen in Florida recently restrictions on access to medical treatment for transgender adults. So, you know, it's created tremendous harm and chaos in people's lives, and it's a broad area of restriction. The other category of laws that we've seen passed in rapid succession are restrictions on transgender students in schools in terms of their inclusion in sports programs, but also with regard to their access to restrooms and other gender-separated facilities. And I think, as I glancingly mentioned, Florida passed a law that actually restricts transgender people's access to restrooms in government facilities, which has had huge negative impact on employment for first responders, firefighters, police, and others, you know, who are limited just from really living and moving in ordinary ways throughout the day. Somebody mentioned in the chat that Virginia, along with a number of other states, have actually passed these laws commonly referred to as Don't Say Gay or Trans, that restricts the ability of students and teachers to talk about, you know, common things in their life if it relates to LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer topics. It has been enormously impactful, negatively impactful on students and teachers, and has really had a chilling effect even outside of the states in which those laws are passed, where we're seeing even in more progressive states, the undoing, the unraveling of inclusive non-discrimination policies and curriculum in schools. There are also states now that have passed laws actually requiring teachers to disclose the fact of a student either exploring their gender identity or sharing with other people in the school environment information about their being transgender, really significantly disrupting the ability of students to get the support of teachers and administrators in schools that they need to be able to share information with their families and build the support around them that they need. So this is kind of a starting point to say the degree of backlash that transgender people are facing in this country is real, serious, expanding. There are many legal challenges to those state laws. I'm happy to talk about that if and as we have time. I'd rather really focus on the concentrated subject of this discussion, but happy to talk about that. But what I do want to say is that it's so important to be able to ensure the robust protections for transgender people under the laws that exist. We've had some really important advances in ensuring protections under disability laws for transgender people. And I want to turn it over to Ezra to talk and provide some more background and detail about who transgender people are and how the work is moving forward. So with that, Ezra, I'll turn it over to you. And we can take the map off so folks can, focus on Ezra.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. I am a light-skinned Latino man. I use he, him pronouns. I have glasses and short brown hair. I'm wearing a navy suit jacket and blue collared shirt. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about gender dysphoria, as Jennifer alluded to. Some of this might be a refresher for some of you, some of this might be new. Either way, hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what we talk about when we talk about gender dysphoria. So transgender people, it's essentially an umbrella term for a lot of different people, some of whom experience a condition we call gender dysphoria, which is a medical diagnosis. Not all transgender people have gender dysphoria, but a lot of us do. When we're talking about, and Kevin will pick up on this later, disability rights angles to transgender rights issues, we're usually focusing narrowly on the group of transgender people who experience gender dysphoria. So what is gender dysphoria? It's a clinical term that captures a persistent, consistent disconnect between the sex someone's assigned at birth and what their internal sense of identity is. We're not going to get into it in this particular discussion, but many, many decades of research suggest there are things that are physiologically inform people's gender identities, both transgender and non-transgender people. Where did gender dysphoria come from? It's existed in medical contexts for more than 100 years, though it has been defined and called different things over time. As might be familiar to many of you experts in disability rights, as medical science advances and as communities advocate for themselves and learn how to explain themselves to the world, terminology changes. One thing that hasn't changed, though, as Jennifer's alluded to, is there is a pretty consistent and high level of stigma of people with gender dysphoria. Something that people who are maybe new to this area might not be aware of is gender dysphoria has its own sort of complicated relationship within the transgender community itself. A lot of our community members, even those with gender dysphoria, have pretty backwards, bad ideas about what it means to have a disability, let alone what it means to organize around having a disability. So a lot of our own community members will push to not have medicalized language used to explain our experiences or our bodies. That obviously can make it very difficult if Jennifer, Kevin, or I go into court and we're trying to explain to a court, here's our client with a medical condition and they need accommodations under disability laws. But that's something to be aware of. And you might have picked up on this if you talked with different transgender people in your life. when we talk about dysphoria, there's, the internal sense of disconnect with gender. It can cause a lot of different collateral problems. It can exacerbate other mental health conditions, make them more difficult to treat. There are studies that reflect it's harder to keep people on consistent health plans for other totally unrelated conditions like diabetes, people recovering from strokes, all sorts of things. It's sort of an area of interest now that there's slightly less stigma and there's more investment in understanding who transgender people are and what it takes to help us thrive throughout a lifetime. Not everyone with gender dysphoria seeks or desires or has access to procedures or interventions that we commonly label medical transition, primarily hormone blockers, exogenous hormones, surgeries, but many of us do. In the last few decades, in large part because of the advocacy of people like Jennifer, it's been easier for a lot of people, including more recently children, to access these life-saving treatments. But with increased access has come increased lashback. And that's a lot of what we're seeing. If you think back to the map of the United States that Jennifer showed us earlier on, with the different states with all of these very recent anti-transgender laws, a lot of those focus on medical access. They stigmatize transgender people's ability or stigmatize gender dysphoria, and they try to actually outlaw or make it very difficult to access care, either on the pretense of there's a ban because this is a minor child and certain care shouldn't be available to them, a categorical ban on all treatments, or in some jurisdictions, they criminalize the doctors and the providers who provide the care. So it's not technically a crime for a transgender person, sorry, my phone's ringing, for a transgender person to access the care, but it is a crime for their providers to provide the care. When we're talking about sort of the disabling aspects of gender dysphoria, it depends upon the person and what their experience is, but common experiences of dysphoria might make it difficult for someone to leave the house, might make it difficult for them to navigate in public life, especially if they're seen as gender nonconforming, access to sex segregated facilities, regardless of what their body looks like or what their genital configuration is. There can be a lot of distress from the gender dysphoria that makes it hard to engage in public life in much the same way that other disabilities are. I think I'd add to that, there's a growing movement within the transgender community, primarily from people who are already in disability advocacy spaces, to sort of reclaim gender dysphoria as a disability, just the same way that people would talk about being hard of hearing, being blind, having bipolar disorder, what have you. And by bringing the language of disability rights into transgender spaces to talk about the needs in our community, needs in our community and how to sort of best advocate for ourselves. Much of the work that Jennifer and Kevin have done, and I'll let Kevin cover the disability rights stuff under the ADA, has been focused on basically giving courts and giving the public a better understanding of what it means to have gender dysphoria, a better understanding to understand sort of the medical bona fides of what the condition is, the fact that there are treatments that are effective insofar as deeply alleviating the dysphoria or ameliorating it entirely, as well as continuing to make sure that people, especially when they're dependent upon public insurance or if they're in an incarceration setting, that they're able to access this care despite the stigma of gender dysphoria and despite the stigma that sometimes overlaps with simply being transgender. With that, I will kick it off to Kevin to talk about the ADA.
Thank you, Ezra. And thanks everybody for being here today. Panelists. I'm a white man. I am non-transgender. I've got a salt and pepper beard, and I'm wearing a white and black shirt. So I guess my shirt sort of matches my beard. My preferred pronouns are he, him. I'm getting over a cold, so I might be grasping a brown mason jar. I assure you only water is in the jar. Let me do this. I'm going to do my share screen here. This up. Okay. And what I'll talk about now, so in front of you is what is the ADA's transgender exclusion. And this is what Ezra had referred to before. So I won't get too much into the history of it, but essentially in the lead up to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, there was discussion on the Senate floor and an amendment that resulted in the exclusion that you're seeing, or that I will tell you, I will read right now. This exclusion in the ADA says the term disability shall not include, and it goes through a range of conditions. I'll read them: transvestism, transsexualism, pedophilia, exhibitionism, voyeurism, gender identity disorders not resulting from physical impairments, or other sexual behavior disorders. So this is one of the exclusions, and there is additional language, compulsive gambling, psychoactive substance use disorders. So this is the exclusion that I'm going to be discussing right now, and it's at the heart of some of the advocacy that Jennifer and Ezra discussed, and I'll walk through some of it. As to how on earth this exclusion made its way into the ADA, it was the result of several conservative senior senators, William Armstrong, Jesse Helms. They had proposed amendments to the ADA to exclude a range of, as Jennifer said, stigmatized conditions. These conditions were excluded because, according to these senators, they were immoral. And the senators used that language in the legislative history on the floor of the Senate. So this amendment passed. The exclusion remains part of the ADA. By the way, the Rehab Act, which preceded the Americans with Disabilities Act, was retroactively, I guess we could say, amended to include the very same language. Folks with conditions, as Ezra had talked about in the early 80s, folks who had what we would now term gender dysphoria were found protected under the Rehabilitation Act. Following this amendment, the amendment of the Rehab Act, it took that protection away. So in 2008, now I'm going to slide down here. I guess I can back up a little bit. So, well, between 2006, 2008, we've got an advocacy effort underway to amend the ADA. So in 2008, Congress did just that. They amended the ADA, broadening the definition of disability. I was a member of the drafting team working on this language with the disability rights community. So the disability rights drafting team considered at this time removing the trans exclusions that I just showed you. Ultimately, the group didn't do so. And it was chiefly because at that time, it was called the ADA Amendments Act. It was originally referred to as the ADA Restoration Act. It was aimed at restoring congressional intent by overruling 4 Supreme Court decisions. Now, the Supreme Court has never addressed the ADA's transgender exclusions, so the drafting team concluded removing those trans exclusions that I just showed you. That was thought to have been an expansion of the bill, and it would have invited harmful changes from the business community and jeopardized passage of the bill. So that's why with 2008, the ADA Amendments Act, it did not remove the exclusion that I previously. So in 2013, and I'm skipping around now just to kind of set the scene, as Ezra talked about, we've got the DSM-5. Okay, that's published. That removes GID and it adds gender dysphoria. Fast forward 1 year, fall 2014, Caitlin Blatt, trans woman whose picture is here. She's wearing a blue dress, black hair. She files a complaint in a case alleging employment discrimination against her employer. Her employer was Cabela's Retail, and this was in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Cabela, none of these facts are fun to hear about. I'll be brief with them, but Cabela's had misgendered her, refused to use her correct name, to permit her to use the woman's bathroom at the Cabela's building, and they eventually fired her. So she brought suit and raised an ADA claim. So said, you have discriminated against me based on sex discrimination laws, but you've also discriminated against me based on my diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So 2 years later, the district court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, it rules in favor of Ms. Blatt. So this was the first court decision to hold that gender dysphoria is not excluded under the ADA. And the court did just what Ezra did before, though in different, maybe a little bit of different language, but it distinguished gender identity, which the court likened to sexual orientation. In other words, this is not a disability. And it distinguished that from gender dysphoria, which the court said this is a medical condition that can be disabling under disability law, and it is not categorically excluded from the ADA. So following, well, I should say that case involves some terrific advocacy from Ms. Blatt and her lawyers, as well as an amicus brief filed by many national transgender right groups, and another amicus brief, we call it a statement of interest, that was filed by the Department of Justice under the Obama administration. So a lot of attention on this case. Ms. Blatt's words, stick with me. She said in a deposition, all I was doing was being me. That's all I ever wanted. So, but that was her case. And from there, I'm gonna click to this slide. We've got Slate telling us this is a landmark victory for trans rights under the ADA. Shortly after the Blatt decision, members of the disability rights community, as well as LGBTQ+ rights communities, convened a meeting, it was in New York, to discuss the Blatt decision and how these groups can work together to support each other's advocacy in the courts and also legislatively and before the agencies. So at that meeting, there's a representation from a number of groups, but I'm just kind of looking at some of the faces in this photograph I'm showing you of the folks who were at that meeting, but NDRN, DREDF, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Basilon, National Council on Independent Living, that was on the disability side, and many other groups, several other disability groups and many other LGBTQ rights groups. Kind of this coalition building. Since Blatt, many people with gender dysphoria have successfully challenged discrimination under the ADA and the Rehab Act. Okay, so using those arguments developed in the Blatt case. So let me just give you some quick examples. I've got a slide here. So 2017 to 2022, extending Blatt. Some state and county employees have brought disability discrimination claims against their employers for not covering gender affirming care. Okay, so that might be top surgery, that might be bottom surgery. So in Musgrove, for example, this is the one on the left of your screen. This is Skylar J. He made some claims of disability discrimination that led to his disability claims. He also brought sex discrimination claims. Those disability claims in part led to a 6-figure settlement with the University of Georgia. What's interesting in that case, the University of Georgia did not invoke the ADA exclusion. That was a deliberate decision on their part. But that was good to see from where I sit. The Lang case, which is on the right, this is Sergeant Lang. The court ruled for her there under sex discrimination law. That was a terrific result. It went against us under disability law. So the court said just gender dysphoria is excluded under the ADA, and the Rehab Act doesn't apply to exclusions of gender affirming care in health plans. So we see some of this law that is not favorable and under disability discrimination laws. I'll note some federal employees have brought similar claims, disability claims, challenging federal health plans, and Ezra's been closely involved in one of those. There have also been lots of claims involving incarcerated people, okay, against prison officials for denying gender affirming care. I think Jennifer talked a little bit about this, but the types of discrimination we see for incarcerated folks with gender dysphoria, it might be not providing them with gender appropriate housing, certainly, not providing gender appropriate strip searches and clothing, to provide incarcerated folks with gender affirming healthcare. So just like we see outside of the incarceration context. So, and there have been some big successes here, as a picture here of Angelina Resto in a case that Jennifer litigated, the first incarcerated trans person in the country to secure a transfer from a men's to a women's prison following a court order. So her legal challenges included a disability rights challenge. And that brings us to, where I'll finish up, Williams versus Kincaid. So decided August 16th, 2022. That's a case that Jennifer Levi, John Cimino, several of us on the panel were closely involved with. So in that case, we've got the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's the federal court that determines law from Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, North and South Carolina. I'm guessing all of you know that. They held that the ADA, this Fourth Circuit held the ADA and Rehab Act do not exclude gender dysphoria. So the case had similarly, unfortunately, familiar facts there, as we've seen in the incarceration context. So Keisha Williams, diagnosed with gender dysphoria, incarcerated in Virginia, despite the fact that she transitioned a decade and a half earlier. Prison officials there denied her care for gender dysphoria. So they placed her in a men's prison, withdrew her hormone therapy, forced her to shower in the presence of men, subjected her to strip searches by male officers, and denied her access to female commissary items, also misgendered her. So she brought a lawsuit against the prison officials. And this favorable decision, this is the first time that a federal appeals court was asked to decide whether a person with gender dysphoria can bring a claim under federal disability law. So the Black decision was the first district court. Williams versus Kincaid is the first appeals court. And the court held that the people with gender dysphoria are protected by the ADA and the Rehab Act. Lawyers for the state of Virginia tried to overturn that holding in the Fourth Circuit. They call this rehearing en banc, and in the US Supreme Court. They call this a petition for certiorari. But thanks to Ms. Williams, her lawyers, including Jennifer Levi, none of those attempts were successful. This holding remains the law of the land in the Fourth Circuit. So maybe where I'll just finish up, I'll tick off, where might we see more disability challenges? And my co-panelists might have other thoughts. Well, perhaps the failure to provide reasonable accommodations in the workplace to an employee with gender dysphoria. So think about like a modified work schedule to someone who's seeking counseling or recovering from transition surgery. The failure to modify state prison policies that denied trans people affirming care. Public and private schools' failure to reasonably modify policies that deny people with gender dysphoria access to gender appropriate facilities and other services. State laws and actions taken by private businesses that deny people with gender dysphoria access to appropriate facilities, including bathrooms. Jennifer talked about this. We might also see challenges in the context of homeless shelters and foster care, perhaps restrictions on amending government identity documents. So these are all of the places that federal disability law can go and are potential places where we might see more claims. All right, so I'm going to stop my share, leave it there.
If it's okay, I just wanted to say two quick things. Following Kevin's comments, and one is to just recognize how important the ADA can be in terms of access to public accommodations, because it is an area where there are no federal laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex. And transgender people have been able to pursue sex discrimination claims, including in employment, for example, following the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, recognizing that discrimination because somebody is transgender is sex discrimination. And that's been a really powerfully important decision. But because there aren't federal laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of public accommodations, it can be more limited in terms of the scope of its application to transgender people. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention, which is that we haven't talked about, but there are non-binary people who have a gender identity that's not exclusively male or exclusively female, or maybe a fluid gender identity. And gender dysphoria is something that a non-binary person can experience as well, who can't live consistent with their non-binary identity. And so it also provides a potentially really important source of protections in that area as well. So thank you.
Just a reminder to participants, if you have questions, and I eventually got gallery view up so I can see you. So you can either raise your hand, or if you want to drop a question in the comment section. We already have one or one plus a follow-up question from Carolyn Kaywood. If you'd like to take yourself off mute to ask your question aloud, Carolyn, you may do so.
Thank you. I was hoping she would be here. A friend of mine has a transgender child, and the employer's insurance excludes care for transgender medical care. She's trying to get hormone blockers, and they're expensive. Does this offer her any help?
I'm happy. I mean, potentially, yes. I will say that, so there have, there's a lot of
Jennifer, I can speak to this because I've litigated some of these.
Good.
Yeah. So potentially, yes. Employment law is a little bit funky and weird, but essentially, if you're the beneficiary on an employer-provided health plan, like a minor child, technically your parent can sue under a theory of sex discrimination or disability discrimination for the child as their beneficiary. There has been some success with those cases even before Blatt and Williams. One of them is 𝐲𝐬𝐫 v. 𝐶𝐚 Health. It was in the 8th Circuit. I remember it because I wrote the amicus brief for WPAC. But what we're seeing is a lot of those cases are settling out earlier on right now. I'm not sure of any. Jennifer, are you aware of any minor child cases right now that are going on employer-provided plans?
No, I'm not. But
yeah, it's sort of our world is a set of moving targets. So once we solve one problem over here, employer-provided health plans, we sort of have that under wraps. Then new stuff pops up, sort of like the map Jennifer was showing. So once you have the employer-provided coverage, it's great unless your state makes it illegal to access that care.
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, so just to say, I mean, there was a successful challenge to the state of Florida's Medicaid exclusion for coverage that applied to transgender adolescents. So I want to make sure I'm at least accurately answering your question, Ezra. It's a different issue than the question that's in the chat and was just asked about an employer coverage plan. But the other source of protections, just to mention, is also the Affordable Care Act, which has non-discrimination provision as well. And I'll just underscore what Ezra said, that this has been an area in which advocacy through letters to both the employer and to the insurance company has, in my experience, resulted in coverage. and that's one of the reasons I think we haven't seen so many cases in this area, is because just again, to give you kind of a decades long perspective, it used to be that there literally weren't insurance plans available to employers that had coverage. And now that is absolutely not the case. So it's cost effective for employers to have inclusive plans. They sometimes have older plans that haven't been updated. And it's an area where employee advocacy, including employee advocacy by affinity groups, can be really powerfully important.
Right. And I just added that because, and to pick up on Jennifer's thing. So what I've seen, and Jennifer's seen more of it, but yeah, the employer might do like a one-off to meet the parent's concern and to provide that kind of care. And in the litigation, as I had mentioned, it's been tough to make these kind of claims under disability, under our federal disability laws, but there's also sex discrimination laws which can weigh here as well.
The healthcare, access to healthcare issues, I find really important and interesting. And I know in Virginia, not long ago, our Medicaid agency recently adopted policies for coverage of gender-affirming care premised on a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And I know across the country, states are going in different directions on that. And Jennifer, you did a great job earlier of highlighting some of the many areas where transgender rights are under attack across the country. One thing we haven't talked about, I wonder, I'm assuming, and perhaps naively, that that there are at least some states where the ball's moving in the right direction on some things. And I'm wondering if there are, for folks who are interested in transgender advocacy and who are looking for states that are doing good things to emulate in more progressive states, what are some examples of things that folks can look to on that front?
Yes, I appreciate the question, because you're right. I'm so mired in the moment and the backlash that I sometimes forget, because honestly, if we had this, panel 4 years ago, it would sound very different. I mean, there were remarkable advances, including state insurance commission decisions across the country that said the exclusion of gender transition related healthcare violates both state and federal laws. And it's kind of the reason why we have seen that every major insurance provider has inclusive plans of coverage. That was a really important step. The other thing I'll say is, after the Dobbs decision was issued by the Supreme Court, reversing rights of access to abortion, there were a number of states that passed what are sometimes called provider shield laws or provider protection laws that authorized medical providers in states that wanted to assure access to reproductive care, that they would be insulated from any liability for actually providing that care, both to individuals within those states, but also to individuals who needed that care outside of those states. And when those laws were passed, there was a recognition of the attack and restrictions on gender transition related healthcare. So Massachusetts is an example of a state that has a very robust provider shield law that protects against civil and criminal liability medical providers who provide both abortion-related care and gender transition-related healthcare. And there's a small number of states, but a growing number of states that are ensuring that there's access to care, even for families who are in the states like Florida, Alabama, Mississippi. Like I said, there's a long list of them now that are prohibiting care. So there are growing protections in those ways. And we're also seeing more expansive school policies to be inclusive of transgender students. Can give plenty of examples of that. And Ezra, let me let you add on to that, because I think it's important. I agree to highlight the positive steps as well.
Yeah, so building off of what Jennifer was sharing, some states have gone even further than just reaffirming protections that exist for transgender people in healthcare. So I know earlier this year, Oregon, I believe they passed the bill as part of their SHIELD law, also set aside, I believe, $500,000 to give to their Department of Insurance to actually proactively investigate insurance plans in the state to make sure that they did not have exclusions. Anyone who has dealt with the horrific abyss of insurance, anything, health insurance tends to be worse. A lot of these plans with exclusions, they're kind of sticky. No one really remembers when an exclusion got written in, and sometimes they kind of get copied and pasted from policy to policy to policy year after year after year. And when claims are processed, suddenly someone who's a beneficiary discovers, oh no, there's an exclusion, what do we do? So the state of Oregon, and I believe there's advocacy in New York State too, are trying to set aside actual set earmarked funds to investigate plans, basically to do audits of health plans that are being offered within the state. And that hopefully will be a boon to sort of weed out policies that defy state law, but nevertheless still exist and are still being enforced.
I'm going to ask maybe the most hardball question I've got now, which is, so that as you highlighted some of the controversy about relying on disability law and some of the progress that's been made. But I wonder if some folks might wonder, and we also heard a little bit about some of the advances through other laws of recently. So we've got Bostock affirming that transgender discrimination is sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. We've got, Grimm acknowledging that Title IX protects transgender students from discrimination. How do you respond to people who say, well, why do we need disability law protections as well? Why don't we rely on these other things where there's no controversy?
Well, a simple answer would be everything's controversial if people want to come after your rights and come after your kids. The more theoretical position is sort of the goal of the transgender rights movement in the United States is to make sure that transgender people are treated just like everyone else, generally applicable laws that protect everyone, right? Disability laws protect everyone, whether you have a disability or not, whether you invoke the protections or not. That's what transgender people are trying to do. It's just a horrible game of whack-a-mole that we're playing, trying to make sure, well, sex discrimination laws protect us, disability laws protect us, education, civil rights laws protect us, and that's what we're doing. The other thing is there's some particular cases or situations where the remedies or the particular fix you're seeking isn't reachable by sex discrimination law, isn't reachable by constitutional jurisprudence. It's really a disability fix. So usually in that context, and I've had several of these cases, it's some sort of need for an accommodation. Like I had a employment case where a transgender woman, she worked in a call center. She was stealth. She didn't tell people she was trans, but her employer knew. And she was really deeply triggered and had to start seeing a therapist after not having seen one in a long time because her boss made everyone wear football jerseys on Fridays as some sort of like awful team building experiment got wrong. And they gave her like a huge boxy men's jersey. And, for any other person, maybe it would just be distressing and annoying to be forced to engage in this awful team building exercise. But for her, it was deeply troubling, and it was stirring up the gender dysphoria with, clinically significant distress. And so that was a case in which we had to use disability law because there was no other way to sort of conceptualize what was even going on. So, in some cases, you might be able to interchange sex discrimination claims, disability claims, and other things. And others, disability law is really the thing that gets you the remedy you need.
Well, and can I add, I love that response. It's so important to recognize that sometimes the experience is one of disability discrimination. And I always want to, I know we're like getting short on time, because I always want to understand this from the other side, because, you know, it is about a stigmatized medical condition. So, and I'd love to hear more from disability advocates, you know, about one of the ways in which I've tried to explain why it is important to have disability protections for transgender people who face disability discrimination, is to honestly address the ongoing stigma that's associated with disability discrimination. And, you know, it's just true that people within and outside the transgender community misunderstand disability law, particularly disability non-discrimination law, which is predicated on the idea that someone is capable of working with or without reasonable accommodation and shouldn't be prohibited from doing so because of misunderstanding and bias and stigma. And so the solution to the discomfort within and across the transgender community and outside of it, to me, is doing more education around this very basic idea that to have a disability is not to be broken or wrong or impaired, right? I mean, and sometimes I talk to people about the difference between the language of disability in the ADA as compared to the language of disability in, for example, the Social Security Disability Insurance Law, where it really means somebody is unable to work under SSDI, and that's a different standard. But under the ADA, the point is that somebody is capable of doing the job with or without a reasonable accommodation and is prevented from doing so because of stigma and bias and misunderstanding. And so I really want to do that education work inside and outside of the transgender community, because I think it's so important for disability advocacy. So anyway, I think I don't ever understand the discomfort part as being other than just a misunderstanding and perpetuating and propagating stigma. I don't know, John, if you have thoughts on that. I mean, I've loved our work together because it's been so important in kind of bringing these ideas together.
Yeah, well, I don't have an answer to the question, which is why I asked it. But but I think it's I think there are. I think you all made fantastic arguments there, and I think one of the things that, you know, we're running low on time, so it's probably my last question. One of the things that that I think a lot of the disability community feels with respect to transgender issues is that we're largely undereducated. And so as a last sort of follow-up question, where should we go to learn more about the transgender experience and about transgender emerging transgender rights issues, and how we can better be prepared to be an effective ally? I
feel like I've been talking a lot. Ezra or Kevin, I'm happy to. I know we're low on time. I'll be super quick. And then Ezra, go ahead, Ezra. Why don't you respond to that?
Well, I'd say the first step is attending events like this to learn more. You're all intelligent people, given what you do in your life as being advocates. You know how to educate yourselves about these issues. Find books, find groups. Probably don't read our law briefs because they're really boring and they have a bunch of other gobbledygook in them that no one cares about but us. But this is a good step. Be part of emerging movements. I would say also remember there are already a lot of transgender people with disabilities in your communities. The federal benefits case that they talked about earlier, Manning, that's my case, is actually decided before Platt, I'll point out. It was brought on behalf of a federal employee who's blind and has other disabilities. He's the one who wanted to push a disability rights angle on the health insurance exclusion because it was important to him. He is an advocate for disability rights more generally, and he thought it was a bunch of nonsense that trans advocates weren't leaning into disability law. There are people who are very active out there and vocal, and they're part of your communities already. Just engage with them, bring them in, ask them what they think about this.
And I think I want to give Jennifer probably the last word. The other thing I'd say, just from my experience with the ADA Amendments Act, going back, the disability folks working with LGBTQ plus trans community, it's not new. It's with the ADA Amendments Act effort, there was this sense of, we're all in this together. If you're going to craft some legislative compromise, it's going to exclude some of us, you're not going to have a bill. And that was a real learning moment for me. But if we kind of take that back to, as Jennifer talked about, protections for HIV, disability, LGBTQ plus groups, all the way back to Judy Heuman's Crip Camp on Netflix with the 504 regulations. I mean, these groups have always been working together. I see this as really just a continuation of and doing events like this.
I know, I'll take 30 seconds. I mean, I think this is wonderful. And just to pick up on what Kevin said, I mean, we continue to see so much bias and stigma in the access to medical care for people with HIV/AIDS. I mean, the denial of long-term care for people on PrEP is an issue that GLAAD has been working on, bias against, PrEP access more generally. I mean, continued employment discrimination for people with HIV/AIDS. And so really bridging all of these community, LGBTQ community, disability, and just like such a shout out. I mean, Kevin, that meeting that you really helped bring together national advocates across these areas was so powerful, and we should all do it more. And John, thank you so much to you and the Disability Rights Center of Virginia for jumping into this topic with us.
Right.
I want to, before we finish up, just for anyone who's not following the chat, Dana Trainum said that she ordered the book Becoming Nicole, and Jennifer Levi said that is a wonderful book. So maybe for anyone looking for reading material, that's a good place to start. And I want to thank all our panelists for doing this. I know you all have worked with various disability rights organizations for a long time and have been at this for a long time. I'm new to the game, and I've learned so much from you guys already. And every time you guys talk, I feel like I leave a little bit smarter. So this is really great. I'm glad that we were able to cover this material for the folks here today. And I look forward to continuing to work together. All right. Any last minute comments before we go from our panelists?
Thanks to everybody. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.